We're back with our politics lead. There is so much news out there these days, including today. At times, it might feel like a year's worth of headlines crammed into a week-long cycle. There's no shortage of outlets either. Broadcasting, podcasting, tweeting, posting information 24/7. Joining me now is legendary CBS newsman Bob Schieffer. He's out with a new book titled Overload, Finding the Truth in Today's Deluge of News. It's a great book, and we're honored to have you here. Thanks so much for being here, Bob.
Thank you,
I appreciate it. I want to get to your book in a second, but first of all, I want to get your reaction to this tweet from the president. Quote, why isn't the Senate Intelligence Committee looking into the fake news networks in our country to see why so much of our news is just made up fake? Now, speaking of made up and fake, according to the Washington Post's fact checker, President Trump has made 1,145 false or misleading claims in his first 232 days in office. But you heard Sarah Sanders talking about how with the First Amendment comes great responsibility for us. But what about for the president?
I'll put our record up against his. I mean, I really do, and I say that with respect. But, you know, Jake, one of the reasons that Donald Trump got elected was the way he ran his campaign, and whether he knew it or not, he was employing this old strategy that Lyndon Crosby, who is an Australian political consultant, came up with the answer for this, and it was called the dead cat theory. And his theory was, no matter what the conversation is, if you're having a dinner party, if you throw a dead cat in the middle of the table, people are immediately going to start talking about the dead cat. We saw this time and again during the campaign. The narration, the conversation would be going in one direction, then he'd get on the radio or a tweet out early in the morning, throw another cat on the table, and here we are, they're talking about it for the rest of the day. So I kind of look at this as kind of maybe one more dead cat thrown on the table here.
Yes, but it also, you would agree, I'm sure, and you talk about in your book, there is a clear effort to discredit the media. Let's talk about the Tillerson-Trump story. NBC reported, they broke the story that Tillerson, in a private meeting at the Pentagon, had called President Trump a moron. CNN, and I know CBS as well, also matched that and also reported that President Trump knew about it shortly after it happened. Major Garrett at your network broke that, and Caitlin Collins at CNN. And yet he's out there calling it fake news, but White House and administration sources are giving this to us.
Well, you know, I almost felt sorry for Secretary Tillerson. I mean, that presentation he made yesterday when he called that news conference, it was more like a hostage tape than it was like something we would normally get from a Secretary of State. I mean, let's stop and think about this. The Secretary of State calls a news conference to announce that he is loyal to the president.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't understand how he could have any credibility left. You know, when word gets around that the president doesn't like you, that the president doesn't trust you, that he has no confidence in you, and that is the word all over Washington. You're hearing that. I'm hearing that. We're all hearing that. There's no question about that. How can he have any credibility and deal with foreign governments in an effective way? They're not going to pay any attention to him. I thought it was interesting, the Washington Post in their story today, and they love numbering the sources. They said 19 sources in and out of government had told them that Mr. Tillerson is a short-timer.
Yeah. President Trump playing the role of consoler-in-chief twice this week. Puerto Rico, he did that. Many locals were offended, as you know, by him throwing the rolls of paper towels into the crowd. Then a very different kind of tone when he went to Las Vegas, praised the first responders, a very somber, emotional tone. And in many ways, it's tough to reconcile the two different Trumps.
Well, you know, one day, Glenn Thrush, who's a reporter for the New York Times, that I quote in this book in several places, I asked him one day, the president had done something or other, and I said, what does this portend for the future? And he said, you know, the one thing I've learned, he said, you can't say what happened today will have any impact on what happened yesterday or what is going to happen tomorrow. He said, we talk about the 24/7 news cycle, but he said, in Trump's mind, it's a 15-minute news cycle, and said what he says in this 15 minutes, don't make any bets that that's going to have anything to do with what he's going to say in the next 15 minutes or in the previous 15 minutes. I think Glenn Thrush is a pretty smart guy. He's been covering him a long time.
Let's talk about your book. There's been an explosion of fake news, especially after Vegas. But before that, in the last few years, inaccurate information. Let's define fake news. Inaccurate information and made up stories. You refer to it in your book as a clear and present danger. You write, quote, "It is easier and faster to make up stories than it is to correct them. And as we learned during the campaign, once a story, true or false, becomes public, it is all but impossible to remove it from the national dialogue." What's the lesson for the media in what you're saying there?
Well, the lesson is that we have to remember that when the invention of the printing press came along, it changed everything, but it took a while for it to settle in across Europe. This stuff happens now now that everybody who has a phone is a publisher. It goes around the world and back, you know, in a matter of seconds, and we have to recognize where we are here. We're losing newspapers. 126 newspapers have folded in the last 12 years. One reporter in 3 now lives in Washington, New York, or Los Angeles.
Wow.
In big parts of the country, there's no access to accurate information from the traditional sources. 67% of us now are getting a lot of our news from Facebook. That's a great thing. It's a wondrous thing what Facebook can do, but we have to remember that things that appear on Facebook don't go through the same vetting process that things go through when they're printed by the New York Times, the Washington Post, or broadcast on CNN or CBS. Some of this stuff is just wrong, and now we see that the Russians are meddling in it, and there's no question they're doing it in an effort to destabilize and destroy the credibility of the press. You cannot have, Jake, in a democracy as we have it unless citizens have access to independently gathered information that they can compare to the government's version of events. And that's what we do. That's what the founders, that's the assignment they gave us. And when people try to undermine that, they're undermining one of the foundations of our democracy.
The book is Overload, Finding the Truth in Today's Deluge of News. He is a hero of mine. It's always a pleasure to talk to you and to see you, Bob. Thank you so much, Bob.